Eric, let me start with you and ask, well, Bolton's long gone, right? So why...
And persona non grata in, in the White House,
so,
that's for certain.
One of many. So why couldn't President Maduro, President Trump said they've been in communication, make a deal since then?
Well, as to why he couldn't make a deal, I'm afraid I can't answer that question specifically, but what that passage from that interview illustrates, and what we know in addition to that, is that Maduro clearly had opportunities to reach some sort of an agreement, whether it's with Trump 1.0 or whether it's with the Biden administration, that presumably would have guaranteed him some form of immunity, perhaps safe passage out of the country, paved the way for some kind of a, call it, peaceful transition to a new government, whether it was a democratically elected government or whether it was something staged by Maduro's regime, unclear. But those opportunities existed, and they existed, it would appear, up until as recently as only several days ago. I can only imagine, now that he's here in New York sitting in jail in Brooklyn, that Maduro is reflecting on some of those decisions and perhaps regretting the fact that he didn't seize the opportunity when he had it. And I can also only imagine that he must be fuming at, presumably, what has been a betrayal by some of his closest associates. Otherwise, how is it that the U.S. military had the quality of information that it had that allowed it not just to attack Venezuela, that's not so hard, but to seize Maduro with so little in the way of casualties and collateral damage?
Perhaps, though, his willingness to call Trump's bluff also speaks to the surprise from the international community that has been the reaction of surprise that Trump actually pulled the trigger and did this. Hans, if I can bring it to you, how much of a surprise is this, and how altering is it to a world order where the U.S. readopts the Monroe Doctrine, and as Trump now calls it, the Donroe Doctrine?
So you decided to start with the easy questions?
Yes.
Well, first, I'd like to say that it's probably going to be much easier in terms of travel logistics for Eric to have the follow-up interview with President Maduro. But, yeah, it caught everybody by surprise. And I think behind the scenes, there was a certain frustration that Maduro was effectively willing to call the bluff, to say that all the feedback was that it was unlikely that Trump would cross the line. I think that in the interview that Eric had with Maduro in 21, the name that didn't come up was, and who's arguably as or more important than John Bolton, was Marco Rubio, who was a senator at the time. So the two people who pulled Trump back from the meeting were Bolton and Rubio. Bolton might be persona non grata. Marco Rubio is arguably just about the most powerful person in the cabinet now. So I think there was, at a certain point, a frustration that Maduro wouldn't effectively agree to get on a plane and leave. Most of the feedback we'd all gotten was he would only get on a plane at the point of a gun or in a coffin. So not a surprise that that's what it took.
He avoided a coffin, right? So something went right for him there. And it seems as though Delcy Rodríguez, his vice president, whom he did mention in your interview, has capitulated. I mean, she went from saying, like, this is an atrocity, this is a violation of international law, they must bring Maduro back, to saying, like...
She's playing to multiple audiences.
Well, we're willing to cooperate.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think part of what Delcy Rodríguez represents within Chavismo is the sensible view of managing an economy in an appropriate way. Her two guys who kind of run the economy were former finance ministers of Ecuador, very well-trained economists. Their legal advisors, Dentons, are top-notch legal firm. So what she's done, her core group are not Venezuelans. The downside of Venezuelans is they're pretty, it's a bit of a unusual hive of backbiting and sabotage. So for her to delegate to professionals to manage the economy and the legal side, she was uniquely positioned to be the one person who could operate on the international stage. If you look at the failures of in the Biden negotiations, what were the toxic elements of the negotiations? What was the give of the United States? Celia Flores' nephews and Alex Saab. So all the attack points as the give on the Biden side came from that. That was not what Delcy Rodríguez would have been advocating for. In fact, she wasn't, and the advisors to the regime were very opposed to that as well. That didn't come from Delcy.
She is, I think this is what you're saying, Hans, she's a pragmatist, right, in relative terms, within the Chavismo camp or the Chavista camp. And that's useful right now for the Trump administration to have a pragmatist in place, not to have a hardliner. She is trying to keep the hardliners at bay while at the same time having conversations with Marco Rubio and figuring out what the next steps of the plan, assuming there is a plan, are for Venezuela. Those who are shocked, perhaps, that Maria Corina Machado isn't taking over as president of Venezuela should think for a moment about the fact that this has been under, effectively, authoritarian rule for more than a couple of decades now. And there are no well-established, traditional democratic institutions for a democratic government to occupy. They have utterly, for the most part, right, transformed the parliament, transformed the Supreme Court, transformed the judicial system in every respect. Obviously, they're in control of the military, they're in control of the police. It's not like you can just drop a democratically elected leader and government into place and expect that Venezuela is going to function properly, right, Hans?
It's more than that. The U.S. has made multiple mistakes in trying to sweep the bad guys aside and put in the good guys, and that's usually.
You mean just historically in
historically
Latin America?
Iraq? Yes. Iraq is probably the best example. You sweep out the Ba'athists, and then the country doesn't function. To Eric's point, if you've had Chavismo running the country for the last 2-3 decades, that's how the system works. You can't just sweep it away and impose people. A lot of the Maria Corina Machado camp have been outside of Venezuela for decades as well.
Doesn't that also speak against this idea that the administration is going to come in and all of a sudden have Venezuela produce more oil, that you're going to have investors willing to come into the country too, if you're talking about this kind of power vacuum and messiness of the current situation?
I mean, why is Delcy Rodríguez in that position? She increased oil production under the U.S. sanctions policy. That was probably the most brutal sanctions that they've imposed on any other country besides maybe Iran.
North
and
Korea.
She increased oil production the entire time. So if you want somebody who can operate in reasonably okay conditions, get the person who operated in the worst conditions. This woman is good. She is she's been functioning in this environment. I mean, I'd take it one step further in terms of the business community that you want to really take off and start cooperating with American companies. It's the, kids of the wealthy families who've always traditionally been in control of Venezuela who stayed there and operated the companies. All the people who've been outside for too long, if they parachute in and expect it to be the way it was in 1998, it doesn't work that way anymore. So focus it on the people who were able to operate companies in this environment, as in the same way you have somebody operating the economy in this environment.
Eric, you mentioned North Korea, obviously not a huge oil producer, but it makes me think of China. What do you make of this narrative that this kind of pro-sec, Academy Securities narrative that this is a move by the U.S. to lock out competitors in China, for example, from the world's largest oil reserves and a massive, gold reserve, et cetera. How active was China in the Venezuelan economy?
Well, first of all, China was active in the Venezuelan economy. Just by way of example, when I flew to Caracas in 2021 and was cooling my heels at the airport waiting to be taken downtown to get an entry visa, there were 3 clocks on the wall in the waiting room. One was Caracas, one was Moscow, one was Beijing. Right? That tells you everything you need to know about the influences in Venezuela at the time. And in that interview that I had with Maduro, he boasted about Venezuela's strong ties with Russia, with China, with Iran. He mentioned India even. So those are motives, for sure. What are Donald Trump and Marco Rubio's main motives? It's hard to tell. It feels to me on the basis of what I know, that what you described, the sort of effort to box out China, is a secondary motive. Certainly, to keep China from wielding influence in the Western Hemisphere, that's a little higher on the list than denying China access to Venezuelan oil. They're all on the list somewhere. What was number one on the list? Hard to say.
But
was
not
it giving
drugs,
U.S. companies...
right? Not cocaine, because clearly we just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was arguably much more directly tied to the importation of far more cocaine to these U.S.
There
shores.
is a fact set out there.
Yeah.
We can all draw our own conclusions. They don't lead us all to the exact same place.
You know, it's pretty telling that the last state visit that Maduro had was the day before the morning, of the 3rd, with the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese delegation was still in Caracas when we started flying our choppers in. And I got some info on the sort of the scramble among the Chinese to figure out how to get their guys out, how to manage in that environment. But it goes back to your original point, the doctrine. There's always been a view internally that the North-South economic relationship would free us to not be as encumbered on dealing with things in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So the question is, do you do an America's Act like Senator Cassidy's proposal, or do you do it a little bit more at the point of a gun, like it seems like we're doing? But regardless, boxing out our foreign adversaries or competitors, this is a strong statement. It's a gamble. If it works, you reorder the entire energy configuration of the world. Fortune favors the bold.
Terms of diplomacy.
Yeah, fortune favors the bold. They take a big chance, and if this doesn't work, it's not going to project a well-thought-out strategy. But up till now, I have to say, I doubted a lot of the strategy that I was hearing coming out of D.C. A few key people laid out what they thought they were going to do, and I didn't think they could do it. So far, they have.
I mean, you think getting out of your holiday in the Caribbean, your vacation, is difficult. Imagine being a Chinese delegation trying to get out of Caracas. Hans, just to leave it, going back to this point of facing China, because Peter Scheer was with us basically saying that what this is a repeat of the Cold War, where the U.S. is fighting Russia, but on different economic fronts and via proxies. Is that what we're seeing in just about a minute here?
Yeah, I think that's fair, but to Eric's point, there's a lot of levels to this. There's internal U.S. politics, there's the midterm, there are domestic issues that perhaps, Trump would like to distract us from. But yes, there is an obsession with the China threat, and this is a dramatic way of putting things into perspective. I'm less and less concerned that this is an opening the door for China to go into Taiwan, and more looking at it like we have demonstrated that our military capacity exceeds theirs.